Good morning, good afternoon, expats. My name's Jeremy Harper. Thank you for joining for another episode of Expat Mortgages. Today we have a very special guest on the other end of this call. We have Zac Bunston from Bunston Architects down in Melbourne. Good morning, Zac.
Morning, Jez. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Yes, so we had you on last year and of course want to get you back on. We are wanting to chat around expat space, but really around that building and that renovating sort of component. Obviously, you being an architect is the linchpin between someone's thoughts, where it starts around a dinner table as a we should do this to actually planning it out and getting it executed, designed, and then getting it built. So let's jump into it today. I guess firstly, since our last catch up, maybe 6 to 8 months ago, is there anything that you've seen in your industry that you sort of want to highlight to listeners today that you're seeing as trends that have come across?
Oh, in the last 6 months, that's a tough one, Jez. Nothing that really stands out to me. It feels like, if anything, things are starting to pick up again.
Yep.
The architects that I'm talking to seem to potentially have more work now than they did 6 months ago. And in terms of trends, there's nothing on the top of my head. Sorry.
Okay, fantastic. And when you say the works that, the industry's starting to get busy, are we talking, is there a trend there around renovations, full knockdowns, or people looking to sort of subdivide up their existing blocks?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of everything. Our work is predominantly sort of inner city projects, which typically are a renovation, alterations and additions. Typically there's a heritage building at the front and we're looking at an alteration or improving the livability of a house. That seems to be where a lot of our work is, but also whilst retaining the heritage value in the property and in the existing building. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. And so I remember when we spoke last, one of the key issues was construction costs
Yeah.
last year were remaining elevated. Has that changed coming into 2026?
Yes, definitely has. Construction costs always seem to be higher than people want them to be. But in saying that, I think there's a lot of ways that architects and people can mitigate cost blowouts and keep a budget on track. I think probably the most important thing that architects do, believe it or not, is budget management. And that's where we can add a lot of value to a project. So with a lot of our projects, for instance, we're working with quite tight or modest budgets where the budget is the priority. So we often talk about time, cost, quality as like a metric. When cost is the main priority, then you realign the other two items in the metric. So where we've got a lot of budget focused projects, and when we start working on something like that, we can very quickly take square meter calculations just as almost a rule of thumb. We can work back from a budget, which will almost tell us how much floor area we're working with. And that's very much a ballpark estimate, but it's somewhere to start and work back from.
Yeah.
And then anytime we present a set of drawings or we present a design, where from that initial stage, we're working with the builder. So we're actually presenting a set of costings with that design. So it's almost like, in a way, going into a shop. It's like you can buy that for that amount, whereas often there's a disconnect between architecture and what it actually costs. And sometimes you don't find out how much it costs until you're, thousands of dollars into the process and 6 or 12 months down the track, and potentially you've already got planning approval.
Yeah.
And then you find out that this project's over budget. And we see that as the worst possible thing that can happen. There's no point designing something that you can't afford to build. That's wasting our time. It's wasting your money. It's a disaster for everyone.
Yeah.
So the most, as I said, and circling back, the most important thing I believe that architects can do and add value to the project is by managing the client's budget and their expectations. There's also, there's a scenario where someone says, I want this and this and this. I want a, a 4-bedroom house with every bedroom's got to have an ensuite, but then my budget's this.
Yep.
And the architect's role is to step in and say, well, with your budget of that, you can't have a 4-bedroom house. Potentially, you could have a 3 or a 2, or it's about aligning expectations and being clear on what's realistic and what's achievable.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, if you think about from a financing point of view, you break it down to a couple of steps. There's obviously the design and the fees around, engaging an architect. Then there's also the fees around, all the consultants, the fees you need to pay to council, your engineers, your surveyors, your heritage reports, all those to get you up to the DA approval and then the construction certificate. That's not an insignificant amount of money. In fact, I'll probably provide a bit of a breakdown at some point. That does differ between states and councils, but New South Wales, you've got to pay some sort of contribution levy, which is tied into your project cost. There's even like long service levy that the New South Wales government wants you to pay. So there's all these additional costs that are not going to get quoted by the builder because that's out of their scope. So the builder may talk to you about a fixed price being X, but of course, as a client, you've got to have a pool of money to cover off those initial costs up front before you even get to that conversation with the builder. So you're spot on, I think, making sure people are aware that, okay, there's going to be this outlay up front. They could be, typically, and this is probably something I'd get your feedback on, but are you seeing once you get that approval that there's typically a timeline that's valid for, right? Number of years?
Yeah, typically about 2 years.
And so that could be where, a bit of a tools down situation, right? So you may be having a conversation where they've had to outlay all this money to get to that approval, but then they still want, their expectations are still potentially outside of budget. So it may be a case where you say, well, you're going to, before you can actually engage the builder and go through with the build, you need to save a little bit more money to get the full funding for that project.
Yeah, possibly. But also, as you say, it is a long journey to get to DA, and it's a costly journey, but it's also a lengthy one. And it's one that you don't want to do twice. As an office, we prefer to, I guess, over-document early before we get DA approval so that we know what we're getting approval for aligns with the client's expectations and also falls within the budget. There's no point getting DA approval for something that's not realistic. The sort of other side of that is officers often don't want to overly document a building that potentially won't get DA approval. So it's a bit of a balancing act there as to how much documentation the architect does prior to DA approval. But in saying that, it's better to have what we're talking about or the expectations of the client resolved well and truly before you're getting DA approval. And that all circles back to the potential cost of this project. So having high level costings before you're getting approval and not finding out that you're over budget down the line.
Yeah. And just on the financing side, expats do have that option. You can either, for that front end, the bank is not going to lend against that front position against the security. And what I mean by that is if you're saying, okay, once this renovation's done, this knockdown rebuild, the property's going to be worth $2 million, fine. But the bank will only lend against that when we get to the point where we've got a executed fixed build contract. So that first part where you're outlaying for all those consultants and you're paying the council fees, you've got two options. We can pull out equity if you've got that available against the existing property. But typically a lot of people will just try and fund that out of their own savings. And then when you get to the build phase, you can fund it out of your own savings again, or you can do what you call an as-if complete valuation where you should technically get a end value by a valuer to say, yes, once this renovation is complete, we've signed the fixed build contract, it's going to cost you, $500,000 to build. We do agree it's going to be worth $2 million. and the bank will say, yes, we cite that, we agree with the value, we will lend against that end value of $2 million, not the current market value. So you can, I guess, borrow and get that leverage against that end valuation from a funding point of view. So that's something people can think about. You don't necessarily need to have savings to fund this whole journey. You've got that option to go back to the bank and get some leverage against that security value. Okay, so we've talked about sort of the budget and the financing side of it. You did mention earlier, which I want to kind of drill into a bit more, was about the length of the process. So when you talk about the length, like let's break that down. What are you finding? Like where should we be focusing our time when we first engage? Is it spending that time up front around engaging on the design so that it's watertight before we go to council? Or
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. I think any the more time that can go into the design and refining that design pre-DA is certainly worthwhile doing. Um, and I guess once we've got DA approval, that kind of locks the building and the form into place in a way. Obviously, you can always apply for an amendment, but typically it kind of locks the building in externally. So councils aren't concerned about things like, your internal joinery or the tiles going into your bathroom, but they are concerned about things like footprint, your site coverage, overlooking, overshadowing, all the things that contribute to the building's massing. So in the circumstance where you've got DA approval, you're over budget, often or typically the best way to reduce build cost is reduce area. So
yeah,
to do that, you're changing the form of your building, which is changing a lot of those calculations, which contributed to, the DA requirements. So that's that's an exercise that you'd prefer to do and have resolved, have refined before you're getting DA approval.
yeah. And just on that, is there a trend? So if you have to go back to a client and say, look, we're over budget, for what you want, we're just not going to be able to get there with this current budget. Is there a trend where there's certain things you can kind of modulate out? Is it that extra bathroom that they can lose or reduce the size of the garage? What are you seeing that makes a big difference
Yeah.
to that overall budget if you need to pare something back?
Obviously, every project's so specific, especially the type of work we're working on. So there's no one rule of thumb that you could apply across the board.
Yeah,
But in saying that, the easiest way to reduce cost is to reduce the size of what it is we are building.
yeah,
A lot of our architecture, challenges that our house or the typical Australian house is bigger than it needs to be. Which I strongly believe, like I think and as an office that we're typically building in Australia, we're building houses far bigger than they need to be. And I think in history, we've followed an American model of housing, whereas if you compare that or our housing model to, say, a Japanese model, they make much smaller spaces work a lot harder, rather than an American model of a room for each use of space. So a room to study in, a room, for a gym, a room to watch movies. An alternative model is a smaller space or a space which facilitates multiple different programs. I know this is getting into sort of the fine grain of design, but typically if you can build smaller and more efficiently, that's going to be cheaper
yeah.
than building larger, potentially unused spaces or excessive spaces in a house. So our I guess motto would always be to design smaller. It's going to be cheaper, and let's look at how the spaces are used. Let's design them really well, rather than bigger areas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember seeing a heat map of some of the typical houses, and you can just see where there's just so much dead space that people just don't even go into, so many rooms. Are you seeing on that, is there any trends there where people, I mean, like I think I look at growing up, it felt like everyone had a separate dining room and they'd go
Yeah.
and have their midweek dinner. And I just, now I'd imagine that's evolved to a lot of people having a lot of meals around an extension of the kitchen, right? Is there any
Yeah.
other trends that you see like that people are requesting?
Again, it's so project specific. Like if you're living on a 100 square meter block in the inner city, you might not have the luxury. Well, you probably likely won't have the luxury of a separate dining room,
Yeah.
or you definitely won't have a big backyard. So the quarter acre Australian dream house is no longer a thing.
Yeah.
We're living denser and will continue to live denser. And there's a lot of studies that show, living in high density has a much better outcome than an urban sprawl where we could potentially maintain this quarter acre dream and a backyard.
In a backyard. That's interesting. So if I'm an expat and I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, what can I do to, as part of my renovation, to maximize the value of the property? So obviously the dining room's probably not going to be on that agenda. What do you think people should be looking for? If you're an expat and you're sort of not sure around the local trends, but what are you seeing that, what do you think goes, yep, if we add, a separate study, that's a space for someone to work from home, is that going to add value? Or you mentioned a gym earlier, the space for that.
I think it's so, and like all of our projects are so project specific, client specific. So my advice there would be to be working with an architect and outlining what you want to achieve from a house. So how you want to live in it, how you want to use it, how you're going to entertain in this house. Uh, all the sort of day-to-day things that you do. And then I'd be actually presenting that to your architect, working with them to design a house around how you want to live and how, how you want to do life, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we've got a little bit of a quick fire question round to kick things off. So we've talked about getting the design decisions locked away early.
Yeah.
So having a little bit of a mood board. Is there any, I guess, tips around that for clients that are thinking about what do they want the design to look like?
Yes, I think that's always secondary to how you want the design to function, though. And I think
Yeah.
uh, resolve how you want it to function and facilitate your life before you start looking at how it's going to look, or potentially how it's going to feel. Often they're sort of the second step to the whole design process. But yeah, sure, mood boards or all kinds of things can assist that discussion with your architect on how this place is going to look and feel.
Yeah.
It could be an artwork. It could be you visited a hotel and you liked how you felt in a certain space. It could be a library that you've sat in, or references from all over the place are relevant in that discussion.
Okay. And for the overseas clients, so where do they normally, from your experience, where are they blowing out their budget without realizing it? Is there a certain area theme there?
Um, Again, I think I would just circle back to building too big. Like I think we can reduce project costs by making them smaller.
I guess all.
I think that's the easiest way to reduce building costs. Certainly finishes, yes, they contribute to an overall cost and potentially a cost blowout, but changing them, I think, is only going to marginally reduce the cost of work as opposed to reducing the size of it. I think will make a significant difference. Potentially how things are constructed too. So lightweight opposed to, say, brickwork, or there's always construction alternatives which can make things cheaper. Efficiencies in design. So if they're designed efficiently, they're typically more efficient to build. That can make it cheaper, faster. So yeah, there's lots of things that you can do to reduce a blowout. Not sure if I'm answering your question there.
No, it makes sense. And on the build side, so what are some warning signs that we need to look for when we are picking a builder, or when you're doing that sort of helping your clients assessing builders?
I think the most important thing is picking someone that you're going to be able to work with for a long period of time. And I'd say the same about an architect.
Mm.
Most building projects, you're typically working with that person for in excess of 12 months, 2 years. Your architect maybe 3 or 4 years. So you want to pick someone that you can get on well with, and
Yeah.
you can pick up the phone, you can give them a call, you can say, hey, Jez, what do you think about this? You want to be able to develop a really good relationship with them. You want someone that's trustworthy. So someone that you know is going to do the right thing by you. There's a lot of stuff in buildings that you don't see. There's a lot of stuff hidden behind, the tiles and in the walls that you don't see. And it is a leap of faith. So you want to be picking someone that does good work, that prides themselves on their workmanship, and is going to deliver you the right outcome. And also, someone that's motivated by building a great product rather than being, say, motivated by profits or a financial component. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And in terms of timelines, what should expats think about in terms of like what's realistic here in terms of if they want to do a knockdown rebuild on their house in say it's in inner Melbourne, what are we talking about in terms of start to finish?
Again, it's very project specific, but I'd be allowing a year for planning.
Yeah.
So designing, planning approvals, and then at least another 12 months for your build as well. So, it's a decent timeline and commitment, that's for sure.
Definitely. And I finally had a question just around sort of there's been a few changes around the energy efficiency. So it's the NCC Act.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that and how is that impacting the design brief, or is it not really?
It is, and like we're even seeing any or sustainability requirements change at a council level too, which is all of those changes are a step in the right direction. So
Hmm.
things like getting gas out of our building, that's a positive, that leads to a positive outcome. Things like getting solar panels on our roof, that's a great outcome. Improving how our buildings, retain heat in the winter and keep the heat out in the summer. Things like all our insulation values, they're all important, and they're all an important part of the design process too.
Yep. Okay. Fantastic. So just to summarize, we've talked about getting the brief done early. So getting your mood board done, find your inspiration, sit down with your architect, work that out before, you start to even speak to builders. So get that design done. Understand, the cost of the project. So that may be how you're going to fund it. Is it savings? Is it from the bank? Is it a blended mix? When is that cash going to come in and go out? So from a cash flow point of view, that's also really important to understand. Selecting the right builder. So we talked about, making sure a builder that's engaged with you, it's going to be there for the long term. I think also that ties in a little bit with timing of the project. So if you've got a builder that's going to be taking on your project and working on that exclusively, that's going to have a big impact versus some builders may try and take on multiple projects and then shuffle their subbies around and they're no longer a builder, they're just more of a project manager, which can cause issues. Assuming there's going to be some time to get approvals done. So Zac, you mentioned 12 months for that period. And if it comes in earlier, fantastic. And then just making sure your documentation's in place so we can get finance and valuations done, but that's probably more at the build stage. So a fair bit we went through today, guys. If you've got any questions or you want to reach out to Zac, we'll put through his contact details in the show notes, but your website's Bunston.studio. Some pretty cool projects in there that you've worked on. I think you'll find you in a few magazines online.
Thanks, Jez. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of architectural magazines. So go do some snooping. He's got some pretty cool stuff there. But that's it for today, guys. Thank you very much for your time, Zac. Thanks everyone for listening. Until then, thank you for your time and everyone have a great day. Cheers.